We all have challenges in life: sadness, broken relationships, anger, bullying, grief, and isolation. But there is hope. Together, we can learn how to bring back joy, re engage with life, restore relationships, and to be alone without being lonely. Welcome to Psychology Talks.
Thank you for joining us today. We have Dr. Julie Schaefer back with us. She is a psychologist and relationship coach, and she is going to be talking with us today about boundaries.
Hi, nice
Hi,
to be here
Julie.
again.
Thank you for
Yeah.
coming back. I so appreciate it. You've offered so many wonderful insights last time about how to navigate relationships. So, what is a boundary?
Oh, boundaries. Boundaries are so important in relationships. A boundary is it's kind of the difference between you and another person. And seeing that line and then honoring it and asking that the other person honor it too.
Okay. And a lot of people have trouble not only identifying what that line is for themselves,
Mhm.
but how to establish that with someone else. It can feel very hurtful,
Mhm.
I think, or maybe there's the fear
Mhm.
of having to establish a boundary with someone being hurtful or painful to that other person and feeling mean.
Feeling mean,
Just
yes.
kind of mean.
Like because you're having to say no sometimes.
Yeah,
And that feels mean.
it can. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, how does someone know where they end and someone else begins, emotionally speaking?
Well, so last time we talked about owning your own emotions,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a really good place to start.
Okay.
And so what that means is tuning into how you're feeling about the situation and labeling that feeling.
Okay.
So if you're angry, you're angry. If you're sad, you're sad. Sometimes you're more than one thing at once, right? You can be
Right.
very hurt and disappointed and angry all at the same time,
Yes,
right?
you can. And those things can be really confusing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. So start with labeling them.
okay.
And then that will help you know a little bit more about what's going on with you.
Okay.
And once you are a little more clear about what's going on with you, you can tell the other person what that is, or you can make a decision about what you want. So if you need to say no about something, you'll know that a little bit better. You'll know, oh, I don't want to go to that restaurant. I don't feel like eating Italian food tonight. Maybe you want pizza instead.
Right. So it's about really simple things. And it doesn't have to be some huge, emotionally laden, deep topic we're talking about. This can
No.
be about where we're going to go to dinner.
Very simple.
Okay.
And I think it really does start with being able to express your opinions and your desires. And that way you kind of get used to it.
Okay.
And then once you're able to do it on little things, you could do it on bigger things.
Okay.
I encourage people to start small and work your way up.
And why is it that people have a difficult time expressing their desires or even recognizing maybe what those are?
A lot of times people haven't been given the freedom to do so themselves. Other people sort of impose their opinions on you. So then it's hard for you to know what you want.
Okay.
And that can start in childhood with your parents, because and as a parent, you have to do that when the child is young. Some parents just don't know when to stop.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
So it can become a habit.
Right. It
And
becomes
so
yeah.
then it becomes your habit to be in that place of allowing other people to make decisions for you, even when your desire or what you know is best for you and your plans and your goals in life, or what you feel maybe your purpose in life is, might be very different.
Right. Right.
So I can see that affecting all kinds of things. Things like what kind of career you choose.
Exactly. You know, there's the lots and lots of stories about young adults who go off to college and they're going to be a lawyer or a doctor because that's what their parents wanted, and then they discovered that wasn't what they wanted.
Right.
And they have to set that boundary at that point, and that is so hard.
Yeah.
And if you have to set a hard boundary like that, I'd really hope that you can find somebody to support you in that,
Right.
because you're often going up against a person who's hard to set a boundary with.
So maybe someone who's very strong-willed, or maybe someone that you have been in that habit of allowing them to set boundaries for you.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to then change the dynamic of that relationship.
Yes, yes. And that is a very hard thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so having support is really helps you do that.
Right. So it seems like there can be times when it might be more difficult for some people than it is for others.
Yeah. Well, there's a yes, short answer. So women sometimes struggle with this more than men. Obviously not all women, that's a pretty broad statement, but culturally women are taught to be more agreeable than men.
Mm-hmm.
And so setting a boundary and saying no can be difficult for people who are agreeable.
Okay.
There's also some cultural differences, so it can be easier in some cultures to say no and set boundaries than in other cultures. And I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind when you're navigating this, is kind of where you're coming from and where are the people you're relating to coming from on this.
Right. But regardless of what culture you're coming from or your personality type or what your past experiences are, there's still going to be pieces of this that are going to be relevant to everyone,
Mm-hmm.
that are going to be pertinent to determining what's healthy for you
Mm-hmm.
and for the people around you. I think, we talked quite a bit in the last episodes that you joined us on about having a relationship that works well for both people. And I think that's part of what happens in establishing boundaries, is it's not just about you, but it's also about the other person, but doing it in such a way that having the other person in their interest, they don't supersede what your interests are or what your best interests are.
Right. I think this would be a good time to talk a little bit about how to communicate assertively, because that's really at the core of assertive communication.
Mm-hmm.
And that is this respect for the other person as well as yourself.
Yeah.
So that you're both, like when you talk assertively, you're on the same level.
Okay.
The
So
other,
it's not about putting the other person down.
right.
So it's not about disrespecting someone. It's about establishing what works for both people in a way that still respects and honors both people.
Yes, and the key here is both people.
Right.
So there's other ways to communicate. There's aggressive communication, where the person who's being aggressive is asserting that their rights are more important than the other person's rights.
Right.
And then there's passive communication, which is the opposite, where the person communicating sort of assumes that the other person has more rights than they do.
Okay.
But what I'm saying is assertive communication says, okay, well, we're both in this, and I have some things that are important to me, and you have things that are important to you, and I'm going to respect that about you, and I'm going to respect that about me too.
Yeah. And so I can see where there could be some challenge in navigating that, especially if someone has authority over you. So maybe in a relationship with a boss, or with maybe a physician, where you feel like that person has more authority or knowledge or power in the relationship than you do. But I could also see this in a parent-child relationship.
Yes.
And children have boundaries too.
Yes. Oh, and every 2-year-old can tell you their boundaries.
That's right. Absolutely. So, so let's talk about what you were just bringing up with the assertive communication, the aggressive communication, the passive communication, and the assertive communication.
Right.
So I think you were about to tell us more about the assertive communication.
I was, and I'm going to start with a really quick little note, because you brought up some very important points about situations when you might not want to communicate assertively, that maybe communicating passively is better, like if with your boss. So assertive communication is really good in a relationship where you're communicating between two equals.
Okay.
And otherwise you might not want to do it quite this way. So keep that in mind. But assertive communication is coming from a place where I respect my rights and I respect your rights.
Okay.
So I start out by acknowledging you in the situation from your perspective. And I talk about that for, just a sentence or two.
Okay.
And then I go into how the situation is affecting me.
Okay.
So first I acknowledge you, then I acknowledge me, and then I would make a request.
Okay. Can you give an example of what that might look like, or how someone might navigate that piece?
Yeah. So I want to, let's say, I want to attend a function. I want to go to a play, and my husband doesn't want to go.
Okay.
And I want to ask him if he would come with me. I'm sure that's, husbands don't always want to go with their wives to things. So I think, okay, how do I ask my husband so he might want to go with me? So I might approach him and say, look, I know that going to plays isn't always your favorite thing to do, but it would really mean a lot to me if you came with me to this play. I think you might like it. So would you go with me? And he's free to say no.
Okay. So him establishing his boundary.
Yes. Yes. And he can say, no, that doesn't work for me. I'm busy that night. Or, I'm sure you think it would work for me, but I just don't really want to go.
Okay. And so part of establishing boundaries is also recognizing that other people have boundaries too.
And respecting them.
Yeah.
Just as you want them to respect yours.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so what are some other aspects of recognizing our own boundaries that maybe we could talk about?
Well, I think it's important to know what you want, like know your opinion and know what's important to you.
Okay.
And I sometimes run into people who they're so busy making everybody else happy, they don't always quite know what would make themselves happy.
Okay.
And when that happens, I encourage people to start looking at various situations and deciding what they prefer.
Okay.
So where do you want to go for dinner tonight, honey? I don't care, right? Well, instead of saying I don't care, pick something. Maybe you don't care, just pick something.
Okay.
And start that process of deciding that you're going to go for whatever's behind door A.
Okay. And so I can say this happens in my relationship with my husband. He will say, what do you want for dinner? And I will say, I don't know what I want. I know what I don't want.
Yes.
Sometimes it's easier for us to
Yeah.
say what we don't want versus recognizing what we do.
Right.
Is that still a boundary?
It is sort of. I find that it's a thing that happens where you don't give the person the information they really need. So that's true. You don't want Mexican food, right? But you didn't really answer the question, right? So in that scenario, if you don't know what you want, but you don't want Mexican food, then and you let your husband decide, then you can't. And it's my opinion, you can't complain after that.
Okay.
Right.
So you've given up a little bit of power in that situation.
Right.
And so you have to be okay with, say, if you're going to respond like that, you have to respect their boundary.
Right.
And you've just given them the power to choose in that particular situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
that's funny you say that, because that was a kind of a dynamic between me and my husband too. And it was like, what do you want for dinner? I don't care. Well, how about spaghetti? No, don't want spaghetti. And we would go down this whole list. And so that's where I'm coming from a little bit on that. Like if he says he doesn't care, then he doesn't care.
Yeah.
So,
We've
right.
named it in my family. We call it the I don't know game.
Yeah, okay. That's good. That's good.
So there's that aspect to a relationship. There's that aspect to establishing a boundary. And maybe for the other person, maybe that one isn't a big deal to them.
Right.
And maybe that's not a huge thing where there's conflict or where it's a relationship breaker. But for some places or for some people in those relationships, that's where they're at. And maybe it's because there's a lot of other conflict in other areas of their life.
Right. Or sometimes it's just because you're tired and you can't make a decision.
Right.
Right? There's that too.
Yeah. And so maybe the boundary is, I can't go there right now.
Right.
I don't have the emotional energy to put into making a decision on whatever it is. Can you just decide for me right now?
Yeah. That would be awesome if you could say that.
But it's about recognizing.
It's about recognizing.
It's about recognizing
Exactly.
that that's where you're at. So knowing yourself, which is what you talked about earlier, and recognizing your values. So that was another piece of what we spoke about. So knowing what's important to you, what isn't important. So in that moment, what I have for dinner maybe isn't that important.
Not important.
As long as I eat, I'm good.
Yeah. Right.
But at other times, if it's about what church we attend or what school our child goes to, where we're going to live, what job I'm going to take, those are much more weighty decisions. And those I am going to have much more input about.
Yes. And you should.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so having boundaries around different things, and your boundary can change depending on what the topic is, I guess is where I'm going with that.
Yes. Yes, it can. Yeah.
And so based on your value for whatever the subject is.
Yeah. What's important to you and how important it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
So do you have other thoughts about how we determine for ourselves what is an important boundary?
I think you might need to explore that. If you're not used to setting boundaries, you might have to explore it a little bit.
Yeah, you were talking about making lists, choosing preferences.
Yeah. Yeah. And practicing.
Right.
So sometimes it's about saying, no, you're not going to do something when you don't really care whether you do it or not, but you need to practice saying no.
Right.
So you pick a low stakes situation where saying no isn't going to like upset somebody too much, and you do it and you see like nobody got mad.
Yeah, it wasn't
Right?
the end of the world.
Exactly.
It was gonna be okay if I said no to something.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And practice and do it on low stakes situations, and then as the stakes go up, then you can practice saying no to harder situations.
Right.
Yeah.
And it can be really tough when we feel like there's pressure for us to say yes to something, and maybe it's only perceived pressure.
Yes, sometimes it is only perceived pressure.
Thinking about signing up for the snack list for your child's soccer game or
Right.
whatever it is.
Right.
Feeling pressure to say, you have to do it or you have to volunteer. And there are people that have a difficult time saying no to anything.
Right.
And so saying no to something can feel like a victory.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And sometimes like pressure to sign up for the snack list at school, right? You're getting all this pressure from the other parents. And sometimes people are they can slide those little comments in, and they're kind of don't sound very prickly on the face of them, but they are very shaming. And then that pressure is real.
It is.
It is real. And so you might need to go talk to somebody and process how you're going to respond. Hopefully you have that opportunity before you sign up or don't sign up.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go see a therapist to talk about whether you sign up for the volunteer list, right? But it's about recognizing when you need support, like you were talking about earlier. So if you're going to say no to something that feels like it has a consequence to it, having someone that you can bounce that idea off of.
Yes.
And someone, and not maybe just anyone, but someone that can maybe see both sides of the situation. They can see the pressure. They don't necessarily have to feel it themselves, but they can see the pressure that you're experiencing and understand the consequence.
Right.
So that way they can help you, not give you the answer about it, but help you to figure out for yourself what your value is in that situation and how you establish it.
Right. Right.
And maybe in that situation, your value is to be well-liked. And there aren't a whole lot of other competing pressures. And so you can say, okay, I want to be well-liked. I want the other parents to come to me when they need things. So I'm going to sign up.
Right. Even if it's not the thing you want to do, but you do it because you say this is going to get me something better in the future, something that I need.
Right.
Yeah.
So part of establishing boundaries is not only understanding your values, but being able to do sort of a cost-benefit analysis on what is it going to cost you to say yes, what is it going to cost you to say no.
And I like that because sometimes it does cost you to say yes.
Yeah.
So we get so into the habit of saying yes and being agreeable that we lose track of what it may cost us when we're not saying no when we should.
Right. And every answer has a consequence. Whether it's saying no or saying yes. And you kind of hinted at that a little bit earlier when you talked about, if we say no to someone or something and it's not going to be received well.
Yeah.
There is a consequence to that, a very real one.
Right.
And being able to anticipate what that consequence might be and then being able to know ahead of time whether or not you're willing to accept it is a part of that analysis.
Yeah. Well, and how? Because I can imagine some pretty difficult situations where you're having to say no or set a boundary and deal with a pretty big consequence.
Right.
And so you might have to decide how you're going to deal with the consequence before you set the boundary.
Right.
Yeah.
And some of that, I see this situation in my own practice, and I've seen it in friends where when the couple get together, maybe they make a decision that they're not going to have children.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on, someone changes their mind.
Mm-hmm.
And then that becomes a huge issue.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, do you say yes or do you say no? And I've seen it go both ways.
Yeah.
And so how do you navigate those situations? And is there a changing value that you've had?
Right.
So maybe initially the value wasn't the same as what you place on that particular issue now.
Mm-hmm. That
So
happens
maybe-
a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, it happens a lot when our values change because our circumstances change.
Right.
You might have gotten into that relationship when you were young and you're working on your career, but now you're established in your career and your biological clock is ticking down and you start to realize, hey, you know what? I really do want to have kids, and you've got your career under your belt, so now you can. I can imagine that. I've run into that with my own practice.
Yeah. And I can see this being a situation where it not just that particular situation, but I can see where having a consequence to it could lead to very difficult circumstances for you. So with that example, the circumstance is if I say no, what is that going to change the dynamics in the relationship?
Yes.
And if it does change the dynamics in the relationship, how far am I willing to go to stick to the desire that I now find that I have?
Right.
Versus this relationship and the importance of it. And where's the other person in that?
Yeah.
So we talked
Yeah.
about honoring both people in that. So not only checking yourself, but also checking the other person.
Yes.
And, we talked before about honesty in a relationship. And so this is definitely an aspect of that where you have to have honesty for not only where you're at, but where the other person is, and allowing them to give their ideas on it.
Right. And to have their opinions. Yeah. Sometimes difficult people don't like to let other people have their own opinions. When your opinion differs from the other person, it can feel invalidating to people. And so that's another reason why we want to be agreeable. We want to validate other people because it makes people feel better, makes us feel better. Yeah.
And so part of this is about where our comfort level is with conflict.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a hard one because some people don't mind being in conflict. They're okay with it all day long, and other people, they avoid it like the plague, right?
Right. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so how do people navigate that aspect of it? So let's say you're someone who's conflict avoidant
And you need to set a boundary.
and you need to set a boundary.
So I'd encourage people let's pretend this is within the context of a relationship with one other person, being your partner. And you're having a difficult time, you need to say no to something, or you need to point out something that you're not liking that's happening in the relationship. And you're afraid that that's going to change the dynamic. I would actually start that conversation by explaining that. I have to say something difficult, and I'm really afraid that it's going to hurt the relationship, or I'm really afraid it's going to make you angry. And see what the other person says. And then you can go into, okay, well, this is the situation. This is how I understand it from your perspective. This is how it's affecting me. And this is what I'd really like to have happen.
And so, and maybe even focusing on how scared you are.
Yeah.
Like, this
Yeah,
is really,
really
scary for
scary.
me to say. It's difficult for me to talk with people on this level. But I feel like in order for our relationship to grow, even if you've been married for 20 years, relationships still grow and change. So I need to express this.
Yeah.
And so, and then eliciting or asking for the other person's patience with you,
Yeah.
maybe that's what maybe that's where it needs to go.
Exactly. And I think when you go to somebody and you say, hey, look, this really scares me, but I have to say it, it makes them, you sort of made yourself vulnerable in that moment, right? And so it lets the other person's guard down a little bit, and they understand that you're not coming from a place of demanding that things be a different way or it's all about you and not them. It's like they can relate to you being scared, and starts the conversation off on a better foot.
Well, and when we talk about vulnerability, that's with a safe person.
True.
But we also establish boundaries with people that are unsafe.
Yes.
And that may be the most important place to establish a boundary, right?
Right.
So if someone is unsafe, they're abusive. They are, and maybe that's not physically abusive, maybe it's verbally abusive or emotionally abusive, or they tend to take advantage of us. How do we recognize if we're being taken advantage of?
It's going to be a pattern of behavior. More in a long-term relationship, it's going to happen repeatedly. If you're not seeing it yourself, I bet you other people around you are. Then they may be telling you about it.
Yeah.
So I would listen.
Okay.
And then it's a process of labeling your own emotions when things come up, because if you're being taken advantage of, you're going to have emotional response to it.
Okay.
And so tune into that and ask yourself, am I being taken advantage of here? And if you don't know, maybe you talk to a friend and see what they think, and find out that way.
There's an aspect to that of knowing yourself and listening to your instincts.
Yes.
And so not ignoring that kind of icky feeling you get when someone says you need to blank.
Right.
And maybe that's coercion into something. The thought that just came to mind was, I can see this happening in a lot of new relationships, and maybe it's coercion to get physical, to be drawn into a sexual relationship when you don't want that, or you're not ready for that.
Right.
And so, regardless of age, if you're younger, maybe you're a teenager, or maybe you're an adult, maybe you're 70 and you're dating again. And so, recognizing what your value is and maintaining that.
Right.
Regardless of what the consequence might be.
Right. Because you don't really want to find yourself in a situation at the beginning of a relationship where you're being coerced into doing something that you don't want to do. It's one thing for the other person to apply a little bit of social pressure to see where your boundaries are, but if you don't set those boundaries and be pretty firm, you're not taking care of yourself.
Right.
And if you get into a relationship with somebody who's willing to violate your boundaries that way, what else are they willing to do?
Right. And if they're willing to violate your boundaries on smaller things, then they may be willing to violate them on larger things. And if it is a larger thing that they're trying to pressure you into doing, like sharing your body with them, and that's a huge violation, then that is certainly something that you want to listen to and pay attention to as to whether or not you want this relationship to go further.
Right. Exactly.
And so if they're going to abuse your boundaries, what else might they abuse?
That's a really good question. And they'll take advantage of you. They might tax you emotionally, demand things from you. You might end up being the person taking care of them more so, financially or housing or whatever it is, and that's not where you wanted to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we don't have very much time left. This has gone so quickly. But are there any final thoughts that you have for our audience on how to establish and maintain a healthy boundary?
Well, basically, and I'd kind of sum it up as you really need to know yourself and your own values, and you need to be able to express that. You can use the assertive communication technique I mentioned earlier, and then watch how your relationship partner responds.
Okay. Yeah. And if they don't respond in a way that is honoring of your boundaries, just like you're attempting to honor theirs, then that can be a part of the discussion.
Yes.
It can help grow the relationship, or maybe it's an indication that the relationship needs to change in some manner.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Thank you so much for being here with us today. This has been such a pleasure.
Yeah, it has been fun.
All right. And thank you for joining us today. It has been wonderful to have you here on Psychology Talks. We'll see you again.